Farrell coming to center, dumps it off the boards in the corner. Robert going after it. He scores! Rene Robert! And the Sabres win it again in overtime! Jason Woolley! Jason Woolley! The shot heard round the world!
Hello, everybody. This is Sabres Showdown. This is the crossover event of the year, I would say. We have the fellas from Straight Up Sabres joining the Instigator podcast crew here, and very excited to do this. You know, Brendan, you Taylor, and myself, we've combined a couple times on your show. I know for a couple episodes, and Tyler on our end, we haven't had the privilege of getting this whole group together ever. So this is pretty exciting. How is everyone doing?
Really well. Yeah. Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. And we were just saying before recording, Tyler, it's great to, virtually meet you and whatnot. I know scheduling and whatnot hasn't allowed us to be able to get all of us together, but glad we're making it happen for such a great conversation.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and this came up because something that Taylor tweeted about late summer. It might have even been on Blue Sky. Come to think of it, I forget where the post was put up, but it got my juices flowing, and I was like, we should do a little podcast series here, talk about the best teams in franchise history, do a little bit of a friendly debate, but talk through the best teams in franchise history, see if we can't pull some fans in, and just ultimately try to come to a consensus here to see if we feel that the popular picks, if you will, are indeed the best teams ever, if there's a team that people are overlooking. And that's what this first episode is going to tackle, basically a bracket style showdown. And what we've devised here is a bracket that on one half will have the 1974-1975 Stanley Cup finalists getting a proverbial bye, and they'll await either the 92-93 Sabres team or the 79-80 team. And then the other side of the bracket, and that'll be episode 2, 1998, 1999, another Cup finalist waiting in the wings for either 05-06 or 06-07. So that'll be the nostalgia dump episode, I think. But we're kicking it off with 92-93 and 79-80. We did run a poll on Twitter just to get another piece of background info, a little bit of extra opinion on this that's going to help inform our choice here. But guys, I think one of the funny things that came up as we were planning this was what the last team in would be. And we talked about a few clubs that came and went, and we ultimately landed on 92-93. I think in one part because of the era, it helped identify an era that we hadn't really talked about with the other teams. But we did have a few other honorable mentions, that being the 1978, 1979 team, 97-98, and 2009-2010. And I want to kick off just a little quick conversation about these honorable mention teams. And I want to actually start with 97-98 because, conference finalist, really kind of the first big step of that late 90s era as they led into that Cup final in 99-2000, or sorry, 98-99, apologize. And just your thoughts, you guys thinking back on that team, because that was, a really formative years for a lot of fans, and again, a team that I think, the height of Hasek's era and dominance and probably a really memorable run for a lot of people.
I'll start with this. I think Hasek, he was, great pretty much from the start. He was good from the start. Great. Pretty much his second year as a Sabre, 93-94 wins his first Vezina. But I think when he really becomes Hasek and when he really solidifies himself as the greatest of all time, in my opinion, is around this time, because I think it's the run that starts, they win the division obviously in 97. The playoffs are a little bit, it didn't go well for him, but he, it was his, I believe, third Vezina at that time, which puts him in historic company already. And it's really like December of 97, I would say, that I believe he has 6 shutouts that month. And it starts this run, which is like in 2 years where he has that. He wins Vezina going away. Should I also include the Olympics in 98. And then that goes right all the way on through He also, it's either the 98 or 99 All-Star game is, shuts out everyone in the shootout competition, which seems like it should be impossible against those guys, and then has two of the best playoff runs of all time. So I think this era that we're talking about is incredible. But correct, we're talking about 97, 98 specifically here, right? Just want to make sure because there's a little bit of group chat. Okay,
well, and that was like one of the things we debated because we were like, well, you could really just make a bracket of their conference finalists, right? You have Cup and conference finalists. You have enough to make a small, showdown bracket. And we kind of realized kind of takes a lot of the fun out of it, first of all, but also there's some rhymes there too. I think one of the things that came up was that 97, 98 and 98, 99. A lot of similarities on those teams, not a lot of turnover, pretty cemented core, and ultimately, those guys kind of moved together from one season to the other.
Yeah, definitely. And I think 97, 98 is interesting too, because we're going to talk later obviously about 92, 93, but if you look at it like 94, very fun first round, very memorable, but they're out after one round. 95 and 97 are not the best for Hasek, and he gets hurt in 96, so they didn't make the playoffs. So 98 is the first time where it's like, I believe it's their first conference finals appearance in 18 years at that point. Which is already big on its own.
Yeah. It would have been 1980, I think, would have been the last one.
Yeah, so it's the first one in forever, despite the fact they're always in the playoffs. And it's the first year of Lindy and Darcy. So I think there's definitely at that time a lot of question marks because, they had won the division with Ted Nolan and John Muckler. And then for various circumstances, there's too many to get into, they're both gone. And you have these two new guys. And although the regular season is worse and they're more reliant on Hasek, they have an incredible postseason and, a pretty memorable run as well. Definitely overshadowed by the following year, but I don't know, you look at it and it's like they very easily could have been in the Cup 2 years in a row, given how that series against Washington went. So it is a weirdly forgotten year, kind of in the same way, weirdly, that the 98 Bills are overshadowed by the 99 Bills and what happened after. So that kind of happened simultaneously. I've never really thought about that, but yeah, it's definitely it's not a often discussed Sabres team, but it's basically because of 98, 99.
Yeah, and I think too, that team was a good team. It was a solidly playoff team. I think they finished 6th in the conference. But it was interesting in that basically every underdog won. If you look back at the standings for 97, 98, the whole Eastern Conference basically, bar the Devils, was the teams that made the playoffs were within probably 10, 12 points, so there wasn't a whole lot of separation. There wasn't like, a team that really ran away with it. Like once we get to, 06, 07 and up that way. And then teams later or earlier, I should say, in the 70s and 80s, where you kind of had one or two teams that everybody knew would be there. And then once Ottawa beat New Jersey, basically the whole Eastern Conference opened up, which obviously the Sabres took advantage of, went to the conference final. And to be frank, I still remember, they had a goal that should have been an icing. I believe it was it might've been game 6, but Todd Krieger iced the puck. And it was funny because Todd Krieger, I think, may have scored it, but the connection is Todd Krieger was from Buffalo. And, he's involved in basically a serious deciding goal. And it wasn't like, they ice the puck and they get those couple feet of grace. They basically threw the puck in almost from the Washington blue line at that point. And obviously there's no touch icing or anything like that, but it was a clear icing that for whatever reason the officials missed. And of course, obviously overshadowed by another certain goal that shouldn't have counted the next year. But, it was another sort of turning point or another thing to add into a list for those teams in the 90s. When you go back and you think of, what happened to the 98-99 team, there was the goal against the Flyers that went in through the side of the net that somehow still counted. There was a lot of weird stuff that happened, what seemed to be specifically to the Sabres and specifically around playoff time. So, that's another team that, despite, if you look at the stats, obviously Hasek was the best goaltender on the planet. It wasn't close. Taylor hit on the Olympics and winning the gold in Nagano with the Czech Republic there. But I mean, their leading scorer was like Donald Audette, and he had like 45 points. I mean, this was not a team that was going to go out and score 3 or 4 goals a night. I mean, they were an adequate team 5-on-5, well, except for they had the best goaltender on the planet. So, and I think that's kind of one of the things that we looked at when we were saying, okay, like, are they good enough to make the actual bracket? It was, well, I mean, it was kind of a bunch of guys and then like Superman in the net. And so they ended up where they ended up.
Yeah, I think that's really the main differentiator for me personally. I mean, obviously the main thing it comes down to is one of these teams made the cup and the other one didn't. But I think when you're just evaluating the rosters, I mean, Tyler, I think you hit on it right there. Miro Shatan was the leading scorer on that team with a whopping 46 points. And to take it a step further, that ranked 88th in the NHL this year. Can you imagine that a leading scorer on a team, on a playoff team, is the 88th leading scorer in the NHL? I mean, it's crazy. And so, not to belabor the point, but I think that's really the thing that held this team back was the lack of results that the 98-99 team had, and also the fact that there was just no scoring. Like they had Hasek. He was the engine that drove that bus. And granted, come playoff time, things certainly started to look up for them. You have, I want to say 6 guys with double-digit points in the playoffs, which is great. It's a far cry from the output that they were getting during the regular season, but they just did not have the scoring depth that they needed to, obviously make it further in the playoffs, but just in general, I think be a part of this conversation among the best teams, especially again when you consider the other ones that ended up making the cut, the depth of those teams, the high-end star power of those teams. Just didn't really make a whole lot of sense for 97-98 to get in here.
Yeah, I just want to say,
I think that scoring thing. Sorry, just real quick, the scoring thing too. Like, I feel like there was. I'd have to really go back and look a lot closer, but I just kind of anecdotally, I just remember thinking back like those years from like really like that 96 team through to like I guess to the lockout almost. It always felt like they never had elite scoring. I know Shatan had a few good seasons in there, but they were never ever an elite offensive team,
No.
right? And so, and it's understandable. You get the best goalie ever playing, right? But at the end of the day, like they never seemed threatening as an offensive team. And I think it even speaks to the fact Kolzig shut them down, and then even Belfour, the next year as well. Like they just didn't have enough offense. So.
Well, and they were also going against, at least in that next year, I mean, there was no salary cap, and we're too young to realize it, and there wasn't the social media and the means to get out contract and salary values now. But I mean, it's pretty obvious that the Sabres were not spending a ton of money. So you look at some of the teams that the Sabres would have played, whether it have been, had they gotten past the Capitals. I mean, the Capitals got their doors blown off of them in the final. And really from, 96 through the lockout, it was like whoever got past the Devils in the East, enjoy playing Colorado, Detroit, or Dallas and getting smoked, because those are really the 4 teams that spent the money. And the Sabres just didn't have the guns on the ice to compete. I mean, they had the great equalizer in Dominic Hasek, but you're basically asking a team for 7 or 8 years when you have that goaltender who's in the prime of his career to basically win 16 2-1, 3-2, 1-0 games to win you the thing, and that is a really, really tough ask.
Yeah, and to your point, it's such a weird era because you mentioned the 3 teams from the West that dominated, but between the Rangers winning in 94 and between the Lightning in 04, so that's a 10-year period, the non-Devil playoff or the non-Devil Stanley Cup representatives from the East are hilarious. Like it's the Florida Panthers. The Flyers are not that bad, obviously. The 97 Flyers, they're overmatched, but not terrible. But then it's this Capitals team, which is kind of random. It's the Sabres, who are obviously overmatched, 99. And then later on, you have the
Hurricanes.
In 02, it's the Hurricanes, they had a 0 goal differential in the regular season. Like, it's a really weird time that I know it's kind of crazy the Devils didn't go to like 7 cups, but if there's one more thing I could say for the 98 Sabres, it is that they went 8-1 in the first 2 rounds. And that's,
they
kind
scored
of
a lot while doing it.
Yeah, that was not at all like the regular season. And when you get to the conference finals, it's kind of a coin flip. And I know they were going to get lined up for a slaughter against Detroit, but maybe they don't get swept because of Hasek. In the conference finals, they outscored the Capitals, they had the same number of goals as the Capitals, but they lost in overtime 3 times. So that's, you can say the Capitals, I don't know, maybe they were better equipped for OT, but I think that might just be a little bit of luck. So they're on, this team's obviously on the outskirts for our exercise, but it was it's a real what if that that I guess we don't talk about for obvious reasons.
100%.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Should we move on to the bracket?
So, well, just overall, right? Like, it's just, like, I think, Taylor, you said it a few minutes back, but it's just the fact that they followed this up, that season up with the 98-99 team. They go to the cup, you have no goal, everything that was involved in that 2-year window culminating in that cup final against the Stars just completely overshadows what was another really good run. But for our exercise is one of the reasons we ended up keeping them off. And, we had a couple other teams on our list here that we had kept off. 1978-79 was one of them. There's not much that, none of us were born at that time, so we don't have any, firsthand knowledge to go off. But I wanted to include it myself because I had a chance to speak with Don Luce and then Ed Kilgore for this little project that I'm working on. And I asked Luce just kind of offhand, I actually asked him about 79-80, which is the team we're about to talk about. And he said, well, I actually think that the year before we were better. And I was like, no kidding. And we talked a little bit about it. And he said, everyone almost to a man in that locker room felt that 78-79 team would have or should have won the cup. And they got goalied by the Penguins in the first round. And that was back in the day of I think it was best of 3 then. And so they lost that series. I believe it was 2-1, but might have been 3-1. I forget. But like he said to himself, he's like, "Oh no, that was the better team. Was 78-79." And then I mentioned it to Ed Kilgore. He goes, "Oh yeah, that team was way better." And he remembered he actually went through all these saves that Pittsburgh's goalie made. I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but it was just really funny to hear 2 people involved in that team mention that.
Yeah, I just was looking. It's Dennis Herron is the goalie.
There you go. Thank you.
Household name.
Yeah,
we love Dennis.
And he had a .912 save percentage in 1979, so that's like 1,000.
That's saying something.
Yeah, that's like a .980 now.
Yeah, and it's just another kind of turning doors moment because, as you said, like if they're able to get through that in a short series, and you wonder too, like if that first round, even if Dennis here goes God mode for the first 3 games, you wonder if he's able to sustain it in a best of 7. You know what I mean? And you wonder if he gets, if the Sabres are able to get past that first round, who knows? So it's another sliding doors moment that they get goalied by a guy that nobody outside of, his family and friends have ever heard of.
Yeah, he had 28 saves in the first game, and then they lost in OT. And I think even the OT winner in game 3 was something goofy where, and I can't remember exactly now off the top of my head, but he made 38 saves in game 3, and then they lose, Sabres lose in OT. So that's an interesting one just because, again, it kind of rhymes here with what we're talking about with 97-98 into 99, or 97-98 into 98-99, I apologize. And then also that 78-79 team leading into that Prince of Wales champs team in 79-80. Very quickly, the last honorable mention that we had before we talk about our main matchup was the 09-10 team. Another similarity here with Ryan Miller, standing on his head in the Olympics, much like Dominic Hasek did. You guys have any thoughts on that team? Because I don't look back super fondly on that team, and I just think it was because it was very much in an era of, like, if I may quote the great Jerry Sullivan, the heroic marches to 7th sort of era, where they were kind of good, they were not that great. It's the post-Drury and Briere years that's still very fresh in front of people's minds. And I realized they're division champs that season. They have one of the better regular season finishes in franchise history, as they were able to eclipse 100 points. But that team I feel like was really that Ryan Miller carried them. And maybe I just have a sour taste from that first round series too, because there's that play in Boston I remember it so vividly. Tim Kennedy goes in the corner to the left of Ryan Miller, gets buried by Mark Recchi. Puck comes out in front. They score that game. And then that was just an avalanche from them from that point on in that game specifically, and they never seem to recover in the series. But any thoughts from you guys on that? Brennan, I cut you off earlier, so I want to let you lead this off. But you look back at that 9-10 team, like anything that stands out to you, at least on a positive side. I'm going real negative here, but we should probably talk about some positives too.
I mean, you have Myers winning the Calder, which is great, but ultimately, I agree. I think they're a pretty forgettable team overall. Like, I definitely don't consider them in like the upper echelon of Sabres teams. I mean, look, in reality, that was a 2-line team. They did not have much depth on that team at all. You had Roy Vanek and Pominville, and then you had Tim Connolly finally string together a 70-game season. Stafford was all right then too, but there really was not a whole lot there. And you kind of hit on it. I mean, they just were carried by Ryan Miller. He had one of the, it's funny to say as like a Sabres fan, because you have to kind of say like Hasek aside, but I mean, he had one of the best, goaltending seasons in Sabres history there. And yeah, it just felt like, I think that there's certainly more top end talent on this team than there was on 97, 98. But I mean, you don't really, you have a Vezina, you have a Calder, that's great, but there's not really, any postseason success. It was great that they were able to win the division. But yeah, I don't really view them as one of those teams that is like a defining Sabres team for me in the way that literally every other team in the bracket I would consider to be.
Yeah, they were definitely like, that was the beginning of, well, not the beginning, that was right in the middle of like that leadership void after Drury and Pominville left. Craig Rivet was there, so I think he was wearing the C at the time. It's funny, you talk about depth, and we'll get more into depth when we talk about the teams that are actually in the bracket, but I mean, a lot of times you measure depth by like, okay, well, this team had X amount of 20 goal scorers, and they could roll out these, X, Y, and Z as the third line. And, you look at this team and they had, like 4 guys that had more than 40 points, or 5 guys in a league that, had kind of sort of regressed a little bit toward the hold and grab era, but it was still pretty offense friendly. You're 4 or 5 years removed from the full season lockout there. I don't think they had a 30 goal scorer, which is really weird considering you had Thomas Vanek, who should have been like in his prime. I think that would have been his 4th or 5th NHL season. So you think Thomas Vanek, who potted 40 some odd goals and was 607, you'd kind of keep up that pace.
If he stays healthy, I bet he does. I think he missed 11 games and he scored 20.
Yeah, and I think, but it's like they just had a bunch. It was just bleh. You know what I mean? I think you look at that team, and it's not like they weren't likable. They were just kind of there. And again, you had Ryan Miller go off and do his thing, kind of like, I don't want to say like Hasek, because nobody's like Hasek, but Olympic year, so you can draw the comparisons to what Ryan did in Vancouver compared to what Hasek did in Nagano. But yeah, there just really wasn't much there. And then when you consider where that Bruins team was going, they kind of caught that Bruins team kind of in the beginning of their dynasty, if you will. Because I look back at it, and I think the Sabres were the 2 seed with the division, the division win. But at the same time, or were they the 3 seed? You're right. But also, like, I don't think Boston was like a true 6. You know what I mean? I think Boston was better than their seeding. And even, like, I remember sitting there for game 1, which the Sabres won, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is not going to be pleasant, and sure enough, the Bruins roll off 3 straight And even after winning Game 5, everybody kind of knew that the next time we were going to see a game live, it was going to be next fall.
Yeah, it was. It's a weird thing because you mentioned there being in the middle of that run. I don't know how to call it, like the Pominville, Roy run, whatever. It's basically 07, 08 through.
The post-Drury Briere core, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
In that run, they'd already had basically 2 straight years where they had just missed out in the playoffs for various reasons. They were super frustrating. And because of that, I really personally went into 09-10 being as down as I ever was in the Sabres. And just throughout the first half of the season, it was like, prove it, keep it up. Don't do this. Because they were in a playoff spot, I think, in the season prior until Miller got hurt.
Right.
And that led to Patrick O'Lean having to play.
It's a sore spot for Tyler and I, actually.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it was very frustrating few years. So when they finally got to like February and we're still in the playoff spot, and then Miller had the Olympics he had, it was really exciting. And it was probably 2 months of build up to the playoffs. It really, it was a dud because the Vanek injury, obviously, but it was a very annoying series because this is a stat I heard a couple years ago. Special teams goals in that series: Boston 6, Sabres none, and that, despite the fact that the Bruins were a better and more talented team that was on their way to better things, that kind of is the series right there.
Yeah, so it's not going to help you.
Exactly, and just losing the first round in 6, losing the way they did, makes people not remember this team all that fondly, despite the fact that they were a 100-point team. And it was a weird year, obviously, in Eastern Conference because if you remember, the 5 through 8 seeds won in the first round. So the second round was a bracket of them, and then the conference finals was the 7 versus the 8, which I have to imagine has never happened before. But very, very strange year, and it basically, outside of Miller, it's not that memorable of a team. And the other thing is, besides Miller, it's no one. Well, besides Miller and Myers, which is not a good thing. It's not anyone's best season. It's not Pominville's best season. It's definitely not Vanek's, not Roy's. It's really just Myers having his best season as a rookie, and then Miller having his career year. And because of that, and the early playoff exit, and the fact that they weren't top 10 in scoring, they were actually regressed in scoring from the prior 2 years. Because of all of that, I think that's why we don't look at it all that fondly.
Yeah, those are all really good points. It's just, I just feel there's a lot of sour taste around those teams and that immediate post-Drury era too. I feel like, so it probably clouds judgment. So let's jump in now to the reason that we're here in the actual bracket, and the showdown again to refresh everyone's memory. The 1979-1980 Sabres team, which won the Prince of Wales Trophy. At that time, it was awarded to the regular season champion in the East, so they hadn't yet made it the playoff trophy. So that's why, if you look up in the rafters, there's 2 Prince of Wales champions banners, despite only 1 conference final from that era. And then the other team is 92-93. And so the 92-93 team got 60% of our fan vote, but I feel like the on paper matchup definitely skews heavily to 79-80, because that 79-80 team, 4th best finish for a team in franchise history, 47 wins, 110 points. The other 3 teams to finish that high also on this bracket: 06-07, 05-06, 74-75. And then the 92-93 team was 86 points with 38 wins. But the highlight of that 92-93 team, which I think helps put them in this conversation and I think makes them an interesting candidate, is that this was the McGillney 76 goal year, LaFontaine 148 points. And there's just some fun aspects to it. This team, they sweep Boston in the first round. This is the Mayday goal season. And that first round win is Buffalo's first in the playoffs since 82-83. So it was a 10-year period where the Sabres had not gotten out of the first round or had missed. They had 2 misses in the mid 80s as well. So I think those are like those are the broad strokes, the highlights of that 92-93 team. Whereas 79-80, again, regular season Eastern Conference champions. Still, Perreault still a monster figure for this team. Danny Garrett, 56 goals. I believe he led the NHL, or was among the NHL leaders. I have to double check my notes on that. But also losing ultimately to the eventual Stanley Cup champion and the first year of the Islanders dynasty. So despite maybe a somewhat uneven matchup on paper, I think there's still some really interesting aspects to these 2 teams. Let's start though with the 92-93 team, as they are kind of like our last team in, and just your thoughts, guys, on I guess maybe starting even with like the LaFontaine McGillney pairing, because that like not that they get overshadowed, but the two of them didn't have as much time together as I think you otherwise wish they would have. McGillney got traded after LaFontaine's injury troubles. LaFontaine was hurt so much while he was here, but when those two were healthy, when they were able to combine, they were probably, if not the best duo the team has had, second best behind the rotation of either Perreault Martin, Perreault Robert. Pick your poison with the French Connection, but among the most dangerous forwards the Sabres have ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in first, just given that I'm pretty sure I was the one that made the last minute lobby for 92-93 getting in, because they're admittedly one of my, if not my favorite Sabres team, probably aside from the 05 to 07 teams. But in large part, I think it's also because of the what could have been factor with them. But before I get to that, so I think why they really belong to be here, I'm pretty sure on this. I went back and looked, and I want to say that they have the most Hall of Famers that a Sabres team has had at any point in a single season in franchise history. They lost to the eventual Cup champion Montreal Canadiens. You get to the playoffs. LaFontaine is already playing with a bum knee. He hurts it even further against Boston. I'm pretty sure on the May Day goal, setting that up. And if he's healthy, fully healthy, I should say, maybe that changes things going into Montreal. And I think what's particularly notable too about that Montreal series is that they lost every single game 4-3, with 3 of the 4 losses coming in overtime. So they were right there with them. Taking a step further too, they lose the last 7 games of that season, which obviously doesn't work in their favor. But even if they win one of those games, they end up moving from the 8th seed to the 6th seed, which maybe that changes the course of things in the playoffs. And so you would mention too, Chris, like with that match or the pairing of LaFontaine and Mogilny. I mean, that season is particularly notable. It's the most points by a player in franchise history in a single season, the most goals by a franchise player, and also the most assists too. So, I mean, that is just one of the most lethal pairs that you have. And I think going back to my initial point about the what could have been factor with this team, I think what makes it even more interesting is the idea if they don't make the move for Grant Fuhr. It made sense at the time, of course, because like it's Grant Fuhr, obviously, and you didn't know that Hasek was a year away from becoming what he was going to become. But their numbers were very, very close at the time of the deal. Hasek finished the 92-93 season with an .896 save percentage, and when they acquired Fuhr, he was at .895 with Toronto. Hasek, again, was a year away from winning the first of his Vezinas. So if the Sabres don't end up moving Andreychuk, what does that end up doing in the playoffs? Now, you talk to, I feel like, a lot of people from who were alive then and Sabres fans back then, and I'm pretty sure a lot of them would say, well, Andreychuk never really showed up in the playoffs for the Sabres. But that year with Toronto, he has 19 points in 21 playoff games. And if you still have that offensive firepower, and potentially if LaFontaine doesn't get hurt or just doesn't further hurt his knee against Boston, then we're potentially having a very different conversation. Because like I said, I think when you look at the makeup of the team, I agree, like the results at the end of the day for 79-80 were better. And I think ultimately, I would land on them maybe edging them out a little bit. But when you look at it on paper, though, and like I said, with the amount of Hall of Famers that you had on that team, with the goaltending that you had on that team, even after the Fuhr acquisition, of course, that obviously just, in theory elevates them. I don't think it's a very cut and dry thing personally. I know there's a lot of what ifs involved here, but I think even as things played out, even just the simple, like LaFontaine stays healthy, I think can very much change the conversation here, because I think it's the case with all of this stuff that, like, if any of these teams were able to get over the hump and win a Stanley Cup, are we really having this conversation right now? No, we're not. So I think a lot of what ifs come into play with this entire series that we're going to be doing here. But that's kind of my case for why I think 92-93 is particularly relevant and definitely up there among the best Sabres teams of all time.
Yeah, and very quickly before Tyler or Taylor jump in, just one note on that Andreychuk trade. They traded him in February. February 2nd was when that trade went down. Andreychuk still finishes the 4th leading scorer on that team. The season ended. If Andreychuk just had been hurt, whatever, his final stat line 4th best on that club that year. So,
wasn't that also his total career high in goals that year? I could be wrong on that, but I feel like
I think he only had 29 total for the Sabres. I looking at his total stats. Let's see if it was his career high. Would have been 54. Yeah, it was his very best was that season combined. Yeah, so then he had 53 for Toronto the next season. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when we talk about the 92-93 team, I think that playoff run is what steals the show, right? As you said, they get over the hump and beat Boston. You know, you mentioned the stat that they finally got out of the first round. The bigger thing was that they always ran into the Bruins and could never get over the Bruins. So it was kind of, you know, 2 birds, 1 stone when they get out of the first round and they do it in the fashion that they did it in. But really, even with the cheat code of Mogilny and LaFontaine being healthy and Andreychuk, they were very average. I mean, they had 86 points in an 84 game season. Remember, they played 84 games back then. And they did the similar kind of playoff format that they do now. But there's not wild cards. It's just that it was just used to be the top 4 in the division made the playoffs, and that's kind of why the Sabres always played the Bruins in the playoffs. And you look back at that division, they were going to finish 4th, really come hell or high water. The Canadiens were actually the 3rd seed, and they finished 16 points better than the Sabres that year during the regular season. So the Sabres were firmly locked in at 4th because, and you look at it and you really do wonder how skewed some of those records were in the old Adams division, because the Whalers were really bad. 26 wins for the Whalers out of 84, not great. And the Senators were, I think that was their inaugural year. I mean, they had 10 wins. I mean, they were historically bad. So you had 2 very, very, very bad teams kind of pumping up the rest of that division in terms of their point totals. But, in terms of the playoffs and that run, I think it would have been interesting, not that you could have, changed anything with the standings or anything like that, but if you would have gotten Montreal in the first round, and again, it's the 3rd seed and the 4th seed, so it's not going to happen. But if you would have gotten Montreal with a healthier LaFontaine, put it that way, it would have been interesting to see, because that year, the East, the whole league kind of opened up. In the second round, that was the year the Islanders upset the Penguins with Jagr and Lemieux, and they were back-to-back Cup champs. And that Stanley Cup final obviously was LA's Gretzky's LA playing the Canadiens, and I think the Kings were like a 3 seed in their division as well. You know what I mean? So there was a lot of upsets, if you want to call it that, in the first 2 rounds. It really had the Sabres been able to get over that hump or extend that series against Montreal. Again, we talk about this every team that we've brought up, right? If they would have won 1 or 2 of those games in overtime, and it would have been 2-2 instead of the series being over. I am not of the vintage that recalls certain moments in any of those 4 games that, had a puck bounce this way or had a call gone this way. The Sabres would have won game 1 and the series would have been different, or they would have gotten the split and it would have been different. So I can't really speak to any of that, but I think when we're looking at it compared to the 79-80 team, we'll talk more about the 79-80 team, and Chris kind of brought it up a little bit in terms of his mention of Don Luce and the team prior. But when we get into the 79-80 team, they were like the Harlem Globetrotters. I mean, when we talk about their numbers and their league-wide stats and what they had to offer, they were so good. And they have some things are actually, when you look them up and you line them up side by side, like they each had a goal scorer that tied for the league lead in points, or in goals, I should say. Their top point scorer was top 5 in the league. They had some similarities, but when you boil it all down, we use that word depth again, at all areas of the ice. That the 79-80 team was just much better, and just did not get the bounces that they needed, just as we're talking here, the 92-93 team didn't against Montreal, as they lost, as Brendan said, all 4 games 4-3, which I don't recall ever happening, especially 3 of them in overtime.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Just another 2 things actually on the Fuhrer-Andreychuk trade. Really forgotten about it is it wasn't just Pupa and Andreychuk for Fuhrer. It was Pupa, Andreychuk, and a first, which I don't know who that first ended up being, but there's always a possibility that you can use that as a a trade chip and get someone else going to the playoffs. So that's something. The other thing is that Fuhrer, I think we kind of got at this, but Pupa had been at an 890 save percentage. That's why they wanted to move on from him. Fuhrer as a Sabre for the rest of that season was 891. So he was better. But Pupa was a 922 as a backup in Toronto for the rest of the year. So that's tough. There's a lot of good stuff to say about the 92-93 Sabres. Like Brendan mentioned it being like the most Hall of Famers they've ever had. There's so many good players. They could score. But they were still, despite the fact they could score, they were 6th in goals in the NHL that year. And I don't know if things are skewed a little bit by, we mentioned some of the expansion teams, and, back then expansion teams used to actually be bad. Kids these days would not know about that. But expansion teams used to be horrific. And I think that definitely led to a brief bump, because it was going from the late 80s into the early 90s. It's going down. In 92-93, you definitely see a scoring bump in the NHL. Lemieux, obviously, more so than anyone else, but across the league, you see a lot of really impressive, some of the best totals ever for Hall of Fame players. So that's part of it. The reason they were 6th. And their goaltending wasn't great throughout the year. Despite all the good things, what I get stuck on with this team is they were just not good in the regular season. Not like they weren't as good as they should have been. They were not good, point blank, period. They were not better than this year's Sabres in the regular season. They were not better than 2 years ago Sabre in the regular season. They had 86 points. They were 15th out of 24 teams. And that's already bad enough. And I think, Tyler, you already hit on some of the teams that were behind them. But just real quick, this is the only teams that they beat out in the regular season. The Whalers and North Stars, who were both on the verge of moving, dealing with bad financial stuff, as we said before, not in a salary cap league. The Oilers, after they had to sell everyone because they had no money. The Sharks, Lightning, and Sharks, Lightning, and Senators, who were all expansion teams within their first 2 years. Sharks and Senators both had 24 points. And then the Rangers and Flyers. That's it. That's everyone they're better than in the whole league.
They lost their last 7, though. I mean, and obviously that adds to the argument there. But even if they split half of those, they end up as a 5 seed.
Well, you can't end up as a 5 seed because they play in the division. So they would have been the 4 seed anyway.
To your point, it wouldn't have changed anything. We were getting at that, like, they were kind of stuck, and the only way they wouldn't have played the Bruins is if Quebec or Montreal had passed them. So it wouldn't have changed their position, but it's just kind of crazy to me that a team with all these Hall of Famers that did all this scoring, they have 86 points. And so obviously there's, we'll get to the good part here. They beat the Bruins. They won their first playoff series in 10 years, and they did it in perhaps the most memorable goal in franchise history, and that has to count for something. That has to be, I think, a pretty big consideration here. Right. And then the fact that even without LaFontaine and McGillney, that they played so well against the eventual Stanley Cup champions. That all counts. It's just the reason that I'm eventually going to say it's 79-80 in a walk here is because you just have to have a better regular season than that.
Yeah, and I do wonder as well, like, if you put the Sabres in the other division in their conference, where everybody was kind of lumped together, Penguins obviously with Lemieux ran away with that. They had 119 points, best team in the league by a solid 10 points. But then you only had 14 points separating the Capitals in second and the Rangers in last. And that's bigger than the gap between the Canadiens in third and the Sabres in fourth. So I do, you wonder if the Sabres were put in a division without one of those 3 expansion teams. The Patrick division was the only division without one, and I think you could tell because there wasn't that free win every night, or at least once a week. When you played those other weaker teams, it would be interesting to see how they stacked up. In that last 7 that they lost, they had a handful of games against Boston and Quebec and Montreal, the three teams that were ahead of them, and they obviously didn't come out ahead. They also had a loss to the North Stars, which were, kind of more at their level. There was only a 6-point difference between the two of them. So it would have been interesting to see, obviously, if the Sabres would have even made the playoffs had they been in, the Patrick division, for example. Despite all of that offensive talent that they had that we talked about and that we loved watching, which is crazy to say.
Yeah, and their offensive talent was up at the top of the roster too. So there was a big gulf there. The other side of this debate is, of course, 79-80, and we've talked about them, kind of in and out here as we've gone. And again, they predate the four of us, so there's only so much that we can chime in here with further. But any further things that stand out to you guys, Brennan? I don't know, you want to take the lead here as we talk a little bit more about that 79-80 club?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things you can look at off the top. Of course, Prince of Wales Trophy winner. You can't talk about 79-80 without, of course, acknowledging Bob Suave and Don Edwards co-winning the Vezina. And then Danny Gare led the league in goals. So I think, that as we're talking about with 92-93 having Mo Gilney up there and LaFontaine finishing second in scoring behind Lemieux. Those are things that I think absolutely carry that team and are huge parts of it. But to give them credit for that, you also, of course, I mean, you have a guy leading the league in goals, winning the Rocket Richard. Which actually, now that I think about it, I don't think that was even an award then.
I think he just would have been the league leader at that point. Yeah, I don't know exactly.
Goals. Yeah.
But still, I mean, that's still notable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's huge, and I think that, you have the hardware there, and it was just a great team. I mean, you still have Perreault at that point, of course, who's playing really well. I want to say he eclipsed 100 points that season, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, 106.
Okay, yeah. So, it's across the board. I mean, it's an all-time great team for a reason. They made it as far as they did for a reason, and like I said, while I very much love that 92-93 team, and I think it's a lot of fun and the what ifs and everything, I still think 79-80, they should win. But I agree with, I think, some of the reasons that we gave for why the Twitter poll had skewed the opposite way. However, if I personally had a vote, I would say 79-80 taking the cake in that matchup.
And I do think, like, again, and Taylor, you talked about this too, but like the Mayday goal, like that, the nostalgia piece of this, and then just I think Twitter's probably average user age. Even as Elon's taken over, I feel like the average age of a Twitter user is not going to remember much, if not anything, of 79-80, and they're going to have a better memory of the Mayday goal. But that's got to skew it too. What's crazy about the 79-80 team to me is that you have this is the first 10 years, right, of this franchise. And, they took 2-3 years to get rolling. They make that cup final in 74-75, and they're pretty much, one of the class teams of the East from there on out, and much smaller in NHL at this point, of course. But they end this first decade with an all-time great franchise finish in terms of how the regular season went. They're the conference best in the conference in that regular season. And they managed to run into one of the two dynasties of the 80s in the NHL. And, they lose that's the first year of the Islanders, 4 straight cups. They lose 4-2 in the conference final. They fell behind 3-0 in that series. So there was little, if anything, was going to come of that once the Islanders went up by 3. But kind of wild to think that even going back to 74-75, where, that's the first of back-to-back cups for the Flyers, Bobby Clark and Bernie Parent are, the headliners of that team and all-time NHL greats due in part to that. And so the fact that the Sabres met that freight train in 74-75, and then they run into, of all teams, and the only thing that would have been worse potentially would have been making a cup final and having to play the Oilers, right? So it's just wild that of all the teams to end that run, to end that season, it's the first of a 4 straight cup dynasty.
For sure. And one other stat I want to just add to quickly before I forget that I forgot to mention. Mind you, at the time, ties were still a thing, but that season, the Sabres lost back-to-back games only one time the entire year.
Wow.
Absurd. Mind you, they had a couple of stretches where they had a couple ties in a row here and there, but only once in that entire season did they lose back-to-back games.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, and we talk about it compared to 92-93 for this exercise, and this is a team that was just absolutely insane. Third in the league in goals. Granted, only 21 teams, but third in the league in goals, first in goals against. We obviously mentioned the goaltender splitting the Vezina. And it's funny that, Chris brought up Don Lewison talking about how Don was convinced that the 78-79 team was better and should have won the cup. And I spoke to Rick Sealing, and he basically said they won the first two rounds too early and just couldn't get their legs back in time. And had they gotten their legs earlier in the series against the Islanders, he's convinced they were better than the Islanders and they would have won the cup. And I guess there's some evidence. They got down 3-0, but they came back won games 4 and game 5. But at the same time, the Sabres, back then there was the preliminary round before the quarterfinals, although I did like that they just did the playoffs straight 1-16. Perhaps they should go back to that. The Islanders played one more game in the first two rounds in the Sabres. The Sabres won 3-1 and 3-0. The Islanders won 3-1 and 3-1. So, how much more rust did the Sabres have than the Islanders? Probably not that much. But at the end of the day, the Sabres as a team were nearly 20 points better than the Islanders in the regular season. And we talk about, in every game or in every team that we've brought up, the what if moment, even some of the teams that were, kind of honorable mentions for this. Yes, the Islanders did go up 3-0, but game 2 also they won in double overtime. So if somehow the Sabres are able to beat Billy Smith in overtime there, and that series is 1-1 instead of 2-0, who knows how that changes the course of things. But you look at that roster and how the 79-80 roster, they just had a lot more depth than 92-93, and some of that depth, obviously the Andrechuk trade didn't help the depth by any means, but Danny Garrett, tied for the league lead in goals, Gilles Perreault top 5 in points and assists. We talked about the goaltenders. People forget Jim Schoenfeld was third, I believe, that year in the Norris voting. So they had a little bit of everything that you would expect a Stanley Cup winning team to need. And as Chris said, you run into the Islanders and Billy Smith and the start of their ownership of the first half of the 80s. And, here we sit.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. People don't think of the NHL as a dynasty league, but all these Sabres teams from probably, I guess you'd say the Sabres best era, they would have had to have beaten one of these teams, whether it's Montreal, I guess the Flyers, you want to count that as a mini dynasty.
The Flyers lost to the Islanders in the Cup final too.
Yeah, that's another one. Montreal. The Flyers, I'll count them because they made 5 finals in 7 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, Montreal wins 4 in a row. The Islanders win 4 in a row. Then Edmonton wins 5 of 7. So, they were always going to have to do that. And that's kind of why, it's hard for me to disagree with Don Luce being that he was there and I wasn't born for 13 more years or 14 more years. But the 78-79 team thing, I don't know. I thought there might be something I was missing. I just went and looked it up a little bit in Hockey Reference and all that. And I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. That I'd like to, love to hear more about why they think that, just because they were 22 points worse than the 1980 team. And I was thinking for a second, was it Montreal's last cup? I know Dryden retired right after because he was so exhausted in 79. But I just looked at their roster and they had 12 Hall of Famers and they were coached by Scotty Bowman. They had 115 points.
Yeah, they were okay.
Yeah, so I don't know if the Sabres really would have won the cup. Because they would have had to get the conference final to even play them, but I don't know if they would have. But yeah, it's interesting looking at the 79-80 team. So to your point, Tyler, how that was the 1 versus 16 playoff format. I feel like most hockey fans don't know that they did that for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I don't know. I imagine they stopped because of travel costs, but it's just, I don't think maybe they shouldn't have, and maybe they should bring it back now because they were finally, I think they got up to 21 teams with the merger. So they did away with the preliminary round, which is for the best, especially after how that went against our friend Dennis the year before. And then, the rest of the 80s, it's kind of super unfair how it was, given that it was a league where there was no cap. Spending was way less back then, but there was a bunch of franchises that just had no idea what they were doing. And you have like the Smythe division in a lot of years. It's just a bunch of crap. Like there's teams winning, there's teams making the playoffs with like 58 points or whatever. And then, since it's, they're all in the same division, that means someone in that division has to go to the conference final. Even though, you won the division with 87 points or whoever. And that just created quite a few Stanley Cups where the other team, whoever the losing team was just not nearly as good as the Islanders or Oilers, depending on who it was that year. And granted, those teams are dynastic. They were incredibly dominant, so they're always going to be the favorite. But there's just, a bunch of blah Stanley Cups there where they faced like Vancouver, or I think there's 2 different North Stars Cups. One of those is against the Penguins, though. So I think that was bad. But anyway, more to the point of the 79-80 Sabres, I couldn't agree more with kind of what you said there, Tyler, about how they were good at everything. There's really nothing you could point to that's really a mark against them, except the fact that they lost in the conference finals. They had Perreault in one of his better years with 100 points. Guerra leading the league in goals, like you said. It's just all the way down. The dual Norrises, the way they used to give it out, or not Norris, Vezinas, the way they used to give it out, Schoenfeld. There's just all these guys. And there's also, some guys in the roster, like that's Larry Playfair's first year. So he was coming up. It's one of Jerry Korob's last year. I know he got hurt, but Lindy Ruff, Rick Dudley, like John Van Boxmeer, Tony McKegney, Rick Sealing, just solid all the way around. Like even the guys that aren't stars, it's just there's no one that they iced that was bad. The goaltending was good. The defense was good. They scored a lot. They didn't give up a lot of goals. They won the division. They had the best record in the conference. It just so happened that they ran into a team that had 4 or 5 Hall of Famers on it and weren't able to win. And then it's really extra unfortunate because that was their chance. That Islanders team, the first Cup team, was not as good as the Sabres in the regular season. I think 90-something points. And the following 4 seasons where they win 3 Cups and lose 1, they averaged 110 points a year. And you were never going to get one of those teams. This was their chance to get them, and they didn't. On the other hand, every Sabres team didn't get whoever we're talking about. So, comparing them against the other Sabres teams, that puts them really high up. And, yeah, it's just an unbelievable season. Basically, one of the most flawless seasons that they have.
And I think that's a great way to put it, I think that's what really underlines it. And just to add one little extra wrinkle there, the Islanders beat the Flyers in the final. The Flyers had 116 points that year. So
bring back the 1 versus 16.
Yeah, right. So, the Flyers would have been a very difficult out for the Sabres had they gotten through as well, right? And it would have been the two best teams in the league facing off. That would have made for great headlines. But that Flyers team that we're talking about, we're not judging them, but headlined by Ken Linsman, Reggie Leach, Brian Propp, it was a great team. So, but to talk about like the way to describe that, that flawless regular season is I think a great way to do it, because the big picture of this bracket, when you kind of zoom out on it, is this team and then 06-07. Those are your 2 best regular season performances from the Sabres. The best performance that the Sabres have had by any roster, by any collection of players over the longest stretch that you could judge them by in terms of a regular season. Those are the 2 years. And I think that ultimately that's what tips the scale for me. And I think we're generally all in agreement that at the end of the day, the 79-80 team is the better of these 2. But that's, Taylor, I think you nailed it by describing, kind of that flawless regular season performance. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, like, there was no weakness and there was enough depth, like that Taylor talked about, like 80 and they had 100 something odd points in an 80 game season, so they didn't have the extra games to rack up points. And I looked through the roster, and I think there was only one guy that, if he played 80 games, didn't average at least a half a point a game. So you had contributions from everywhere. And it was funny, Taylor brought up, the 80s in terms of just how they did the playoffs and how you always kind of had like a really crappy team making the playoffs. And I just kind of laughed, and I'm just like, you're talking about the entire decade of Toronto Maple Leafs hockey. Like, that was the 80s Leafs. Like, every year they'd make it with like 71 points and get waxed. But yeah, it's just, it's difficult because you do bring up the fact that the Sabres would have had to get through the Flyers, who were kind of ripping through the other end of that bracket. I mean, I think they beat the North Stars or whoever they played in the other semifinal 4-1, and I don't think that was particularly close. And it's funny, we talked about how, the Islanders did get up 3-0, and then it was a really, really big uphill climb. But at the end of the day, it's a 6-game series, or one of the games the team that ended up winning the series was in double overtime. And when you look at it that way, you're like, oh yeah, maybe the series was pretty close. So it's just you look at it, and again, another great point by Taylor is just like the 79-80 team was just like the other teams that we're talking about, is they basically got as far as every other Sabre team, and if they had gone farther, we'd be talking about it in a whole different light and probably wouldn't be having this greatest team ever bracket, because they would have been the one with the ring compared to the other 50 some that don't. You know what I mean? So here we are, but again, like, it would have been really fun. Obviously, we talked about how that team was a little bit beyond us in terms of us. I don't think any of us were alive for that season, but it would have been fun to watch that team on a nightly basis, just knowing that, like, yeah, we can win a game 8-7, we can win a game 1-0, and it doesn't matter because we have two really good goalies and our lineup is stacked, and good luck. You know what I mean? And really the only other kind of team that I look at in terms of, no matter who you're throwing in net on a nightly basis and you had the scoring depth, was actually the 05-06 team, because the 06-07 team made that move for Dana Zubris. And again, we're going to get to this next episode, but it was pretty much Ryan Miller and one of us in the net for the playoffs in that post deadline, which I really do think affected them. But, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, that 79-80 team, as we talked about, had everything and all the ingredients there to get where they wanted to go, and just came up a little short.
Yeah, they're really, of the two teams here, the more well-rounded team too. To your point, Tyler, better overall goaltending, despite the fact that the other team had Dominic Hasek on the roster and Grant Fuhr. Overall performance of the goaltending certainly tips in the favor of 79-80 as well. So with that in mind, that, so 79-80, if that's the team that we're going to have move on here, they're going to, they slide up now then. And the next episode that we'll have on this end of the bracket, as we look forward to really 2 episodes from now, will be 79-80 versus 74-75, which will be fun to talk through too, because that is, those are the 2 highlight teams of that first decade of that Perreault era. So that makes, in and of itself, will make for a really good conversation. And I think that is where you get even into a juicier debate, because it's not as uneven of a regular season. First of all, those 2 teams are going to be a lot closer in regular season performance and conference final, cup final. There's some similarities there you can pull straws on. So, I think that makes for an exciting second round matchup, semifinal matchup, when it's all said and done. So that'll be for the next one, because the next episode will be the other half of our bracket. It'll be 05-06 versus 06-07, which will be, I think, a more spirited debate, because I feel like those, first of all, we have a lot more firsthand experience with it, but also more front of mind, more recent, more fans have a more passionate view of it too. So, I think the fan vote will also play a heavier role in that one too, when we come around to it.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say symbolic here of 79-80 Sabres moving on, getting to the semifinals, because in my view, this was, despite the fact that the 92-93 Sabres are very cool, this was an easy decision, and they can kind of roll right over them. 79-80 Sabres, first 2 rounds of the playoffs, went 7-1 over the 70-point Canucks and the 87-point Blackhawks. So kind of, similar vibes to what they did then to what they're doing right now.
Very fitting. Yeah, I like that.
Absolutely.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and we'll see how they do when they're faced up against a team that's a little closer to their skill level in the 74-75 team.
Perfect.
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap this up. We appreciate everyone tuning in. This first episode of Sabres Showdown. We're going to be back with another one before you know it here, so that we can talk through that other side of the bracket and start to tee up the semifinals and finals. So be sure to tune in for that as well. And just like this episode, you'll be able to find it on the Straight Up Sabres channel and the Instigator podcast channel. So wherever you choose to find your podcasts, you can listen to it. It would certainly be helpful if you listen to the episode twice to give both sides the extra listens, of course. But yeah, appreciate you guys doing this. This was a lot of fun, and I can't wait to do the next episode. And we appreciate everyone tuning in.
So long.